I will continue my musings on the government, and this will be a somewhat longer recording than the previous one. As the title says, in this recording, I'll be talking about the perceived necessity of the government. Now, statists oftentimes say that the government is necessary for this or that reason. One kind of statism is minarchism, and liberty-minded statists often go towards it. Now, minarchists would be in favor of only of the night watchman state, which would be a model of a state whose only functions are to provide its citizens with the military, the police, and courts, thereby protecting them from aggression, theft, breach of contract, fraud, and the state would be enforcing the property laws only to act as an enforcer of the non-aggression principle, and that would be from Wikipedia. Now, minarchists will argue that they are libertarian, in fact, and that they advocate for freedom. The problem is that any kind of a state or a government is contrary to the notion of freedom. And that is because the state is by definition a monopoly on violence and arbitration. And where there are monopolies, especially monopolies on violence and arbitration, there is no true freedom. Freedom, by definition, stands in contradiction with the initiation of force. Also, freedom stands in contradiction with a monopoly on protection of freedom. There's no freedom if one is compelled by force to have only one model of protection of said freedom or non-aggression principle. In order for the state to secure a real monopoly, there must be initiation of force, i.e. aggression. Thus, the non-aggression principle is violated. So in order to supposedly protect the non-aggression principle, the minarchist state must first violate it. Now, if there is true freedom, there should be freedom of choice on how to safeguard one's own freedom. There must be no monopoly. Thus, if one advocates for freedom, there is no way one could advocate for a state, not even for the minarchist model, without contradicting himself in the process. So to put it in a syllogistic form, Premise 1, freedom includes the freedom to choose how to safeguard one's own freedom. Premise 2, the state violates freedom of choice on safeguarding one's own freedom by monopolizing the means to safeguard one's own freedom. Conclusion, thus, any kind of a state is in violation of and in contradiction with freedom and advocacy thereof. Moreover, freedom isn't given by any external political body. Now, without delving into the whole issue of whether or not libertarian free will exists, we certainly have a perception of its existence, at least to some extent. Freedom is innate to human beings. This is better explained by referencing the self-ownership principle. Everyone owns themselves, and nobody wants to be owned by anybody else. No one is first owned by an external political body and then progressively let go of the shackles to gradually assume a higher level of self-ownership. Thus, from these 2 points, namely that statism is contradictory to freedom, and that freedom is innate and not granted, we can conclude that the state isn't necessary. This should be used as an argument against those who say that they advocate for freedom but allow for a state as a necessary evil. Now, concerning those who actually argue for the state and its necessity, not giving much thought to freedom, there are a few things to take into consideration. First, they'll often say that the absence of the state will lead to chaos, and they'll call this chaos anarchy, even though those terms are not really synonymous. Even communism has the abolition of the state, i.e. anarchy, as its end goal, and communists obviously look at that as very good. Now, we can be reasonably confident that there wasn't absolute chaos before formation of the first states, but a statist could argue that since there were a lot fewer humans and the only technology were rocks and sticks, there weren't enough means to create chaos. But now, the means of chaos production are abundant, so the state is necessary to put those means in check. By that line of reasoning, should self-defense and martial arts classes be banned or regulated, since they offer more power to individuals and thus put the society at a greater risk? If not, then the same applies to weapons. Also, why isn't there a wholesale chaos between countries even though they possess weapons of mass destruction? Because they have incentives just like individuals do. In the absence of an external body imposing force on the states, they effectively run themselves and interact with each other in anarchy. There's no purge-like scenario happening between them, so there's no reason to imagine such a scenario would happen between private individuals. As I've said, statists acknowledge that since people have their rational self-interest in their mind, they'll abstain from crimes for fear of consequences. The exact same thing applies to a free society. I'd argue that in a free society, people would be even more careful of adverse consequences, since retribution, which would be more dispersed and in the hands of private individuals, would come more swiftly and effectively. The reason people commit violent crimes in statist societies is precisely because the vast majority of the population does not possess the means for adequate self-defense, and because the state's defense system is non-existent. The state does not prevent crimes or defend from them, it merely punishes them. Now, after you've tried to convince a statist that people would be fine without compulsory supervision from the state, they'll point to a colloquial example of natural leaders and say, but a leader would inevitably rise up and get things in order. And they wouldn't even realize that they've just contradicted themselves. They first argued that there would be chaos in a stateless society, but then right after that, they've argued that order would necessarily follow the abolition of a state. Or maybe they don't think in those terms, but actually think that a short period of chaos would be followed by a period of dictatorship, but most people haven't thought about it that much, so they don't formulate it in that way. Be that as it may, whether or not that is a contradiction, there is a difference between a state on one hand and people voluntarily accepting leadership of a certain individual or group on the other hand. They're free to abandon that leadership and form their own decisions. With this note, statists have actually argued for a free market. Some smart guy would place an idea on the market and people would buy into it, quote unquote. They don't have to, but they can if they like it. If they stop liking it, they can abandon it. Companies have bosses, but that's voluntary. Also, such an arrangement is just a simple division of labor. Now, it can be allowed that some sort of a social structure is inevitable because humans are a highly sophisticated social species of animals. There is a demand for communities, but the market can provide for it, and thus, those structures need not be compulsory, and as far as we know, for the majority of human history, they haven't been. And even if they have, we've certainly reached a point where they don't have to be, and in this we've been aided by our biological, cultural, and technological evolution. There is a vast array of social and cultural arrangements on the market even now. People are relatively free to choose whichever they like, but they aren't that free to go their own way or create their own social and or cultural arrangements if they choose to do so, but they should be. Order and rules emerge from the vast and complex web of human interactions. Thus, the state or the government is not necessary in any way, shape, or form.